Barnaby adjusted his brass spectacles, the wire frames feeling unusually cold against the bridge of his nose. The great sorting hall, which for centuries had been a cacophony of rustling parchment and joyous elfin chaos, was now eerily still. Outside the frosted windows, the aurora borealis pulsed with a faint, flickering emerald light, as if the very battery of the world's imagination was running dangerously low. This year, the mailbags had been light, terrifyingly so. The digital age had swallowed the scratch of pen on paper, and the ethereal magic that fueled the sleigh was beginning to dim into a soft gray ember. On the massive mahogany table, polished to a mirror finish by a billion letters past, lay a single envelope. It was cream-colored, its edges slightly frayed, as if it had traveled through storms and starlight to arrive. It was sealed with a wax stamp that shimmered with an iridescent, shifting hue. This was the last letter to Santa. It wasn't just the final correspondence of the night. It was a living entity, the last remaining spark in the great hopper of humanity. Barnaby reached out, his gnarled, ink-stained fingers trembling with reverence. As his skin brushed the parchment, a low hum resonated through the vaulted rafters, a sound like 1,000 children whispering at once. The last letter was breathing, its parchment rising and falling with a rhythmic, invisible life. "Master Nicholas," Barnaby whispered, his voice cracking in the silence. "It is here, the final one." Santa Claus stepped out from the lengthening shadows of the hearth. He looked sturdier than a mountain, but older than he had even a century ago. The vibrant crimson of his suit appeared slightly muted under the dim chandeliers, and his eyes, usually like twin stars of mischief, were clouded with a gentle, weary melancholy. He didn't need to be told what lay on the table. He felt it in his marrow, the heavy weight of a world teetering on the edge of forgetting. "Is it truly the last one, old friend?" Santa asked, his voice a low, rhythmic rumble that stirred the dust motes. "The very last, sir. The ink of innocence has run dry across the globe." Santa picked up the letter. It felt light as a feather, yet he held it as if it carried the gravity of the entire earth. He broke the wax seal with a sharp snap. There was no name on the return address, only a symbol, a circle encompassing a heart. As the letter unfolded, it didn't reveal a mundane list of toys. Instead, the wish for the children of the world began to manifest, its presence filling the room with a warmth that smelled of rain on dry earth and home-baked bread. It was a plea for the restoration of wonder. The wish asked that every child, regardless of where they slept or what language they spoke, might wake up with the absolute certainty that they were cherished. It was a request for the invisible threads of human kindness to be woven back into a tapestry of hope. As Santa read, the dying fireplace roared to life, the flames turning a brilliant, defiant goal. The magic was returning, but it was sharper, more urgent than ever before. "Pack the heavy satchel, Barnaby," Santa commanded, his eyes reigniting with a fierce, ancient spark. "The mission has changed. This letter carries a command. We aren't just delivering gifts. We are going on a journey to save the light." Barnaby's fingers trembled as he reached into the very last bin of the great sorting hall. Usually, this bin overflowed with colorful envelopes, glitter-dusted requests, and drawings of reindeer with crooked antlers. Today, it held only one. It was a simple cream envelope, devoid of stickers or scented markers, addressed in a shaky, determined hand, "To the man who listens." He smoothed the edges of the parchment, the silence of the hall pressing against his pointed ears. For nearly 400 years, Barnaby had been the lead archivist of dreams, but this year felt different. The magic of want had been replaced by a heavy gloom of need across the globe. Children weren't asking for plastic robots or talking dolls anymore. In fact, many had stopped writing altogether, their voices stifled by a world that had grown too loud and too fast. "One letter," he whispered, his voice echoing off the high vaulted rafters. The massive clock on the wall, powered by concentrated starlight and premium cocoa beans, ticked sluggishly. The gears groaned, protesting the lack of festive energy that usually kept them humming at a joyous pace. Barnaby tucked the envelope into the deep pocket of his green waistcoat and began the long walk toward the sanctum of solace, where Nicholas sat by the dying embers of the hearth. The hallways were lined with dormant machinery. The toy maker sat cold and silent, its brass cogs dusted with a thin layer of crystalline frost. The reindeer stables, usually filled with the rhythmic stomping of heavy hooves and the comforting smell of sweet clover hay, were hushed. Only Rudolph's nose flickered with a dim, rhythmic amber pulse, like a lonely lighthouse warning of an approaching winter storm. Barnaby passed the kitchen, where the once strong scent of cinnamon and nutmeg was faint, replaced by the crisp, metallic smell of the encroaching polar wind. He reached the massive oak doors of the private study. They were carved with the intricate history of every child who had ever dared to believe, though the newer carvings seemed shallower, harder to see in the dim light. Barnaby knocked, a soft, rhythmic pattern known only to the inner circle of the North Pole. "Come in, Barnaby," a voice rumbled from within. It wasn't the boisterous, belly-shaking laugh of the ancient legends, but a weary, gentle tone that carried the heavy weight of 1,000 years of service. Barnaby pushed the doors open. The room was bathed in the soft glow of a single tallow candle and the fading violet streaks of the aurora outside. Nicholas sat in his high-back chair, his iconic red coat draped over a nearby stool. He wasn't looking at maps, celestial charts, or long lists. He was staring intently at the frost patterns forming on the glass panes. "The bins are empty, sir," Barnaby said softly, bowing his head. "Except for this one." He pulled the cream envelope from his pocket. The paper seemed to pulse with a faint golden light, a stark contrast to the deep blue shadows of the room. Nicholas turned, his blue eyes searching Barnaby's face before finally settling on the letter. He reached out with a weathered hand, his fingers grazing the paper. A small spark, no bigger than a summer firefly, danced between his fingertip and the seal. "The last one," Nicholas murmured, his voice thick with an emotion Barnaby couldn't quite name. He slowly broke the wax seal. As the paper unfurled, the scent of mountain pine and pure hope filled the room. Barnaby's breath hitched as he stared at the cream-colored parchment. It felt warmer than the air in the silent hall, as if it held a faint, pulsing heartbeat. For 300 years, he had categorized the dreams of the world's youth. He knew the difference between a fleeting whim for a tin soldier and a deep-seated longing for a companion. But this letter felt different. It carried a gravity that seemed to pull at the very foundations of the North Pole. With trembling fingers, he used his small silver opener, a gift from the head toy maker long ago, to carefully part the seal. The wax was a deep, translucent blue, the color of the deep ocean under a full moon. As the envelope gave way, a soft, golden glow spilled out, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the frigid air. Barnaby pulled out the single sheet of vellum, his eyes scanning the elegant, handwritten lines. There was no list of gadgets, no mention of sweets, and no sketches of the latest fashions. "Dear Nicholas," the letter began, using the old name, the one whispered in the ancient forests and by the hearths of long-forgotten villages. "The world has grown very quiet. The stars seem further away than they did last year, and the shadows in the corners of our rooms are stretching longer. We do not need things that break or things that rust. We need the one thing that cannot be wrapped in paper or tied with a ribbon. We need to remember how to look at one another and see a friend." Barnaby felt a lump form in his throat. The letter was signed simply, "The Children Who Wait." It wasn't from one person, but seemingly from a collective voice that had finally found its way to the bottom of the sorting bin. He looked around the great sorting hall. The emptiness suddenly made sense. The great clock, which usually ticked with the rhythm of 1,000 joyful hearts, was stuttering. Its golden pendulum swung with a lethargic, heavy motion, each tick sounding like a weary sigh. The magic that powered the North Pole, the aurora that danced above the roof, the heat in the stoves, the very life in the elven limbs, was not fueled by coal or wind. It was fueled by the vibrant, colorful energy of children's hopes. This letter represented a shift in that energy. It was a cry for help that the automated sorting systems and the toy-building charms couldn't process. It was a request for a miracle of the spirit, not a miracle of the workshop. "This is no ordinary Christmas," Barnaby whispered, his voice cracking in the vast hollow space. He realized that if this letter went unanswered, the silence in the hall would become permanent. The frost on the windows was already creeping higher, patterns of jagged ice forming shapes that looked like barred doors. He knew he could not simply file this away or place it in a standard delivery queue. Clutching the vellum to his chest, Barnaby hurried toward the back of the hall. He passed rows of dormant workstations, where saws and hammers lay still, their wooden handles gathering a thin layer of rime. He reached the massive iron-bound doors of the inner sanctum, the place where the great ledger was kept. He didn't knock. With a strength born of sudden, sharp urgency, he pushed the doors open, the hinges groaning in protest against the gathering cold. He had to find the master of the North Pole before the last spark of the aurora flickered out forever.
Barnaby's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that echoed in the cavernous silence of the great sorting hall. With a hand that still shook, he reached for his silver letter opener, a slender tool forged from starlight and ancient memories. He hesitated at the edge of the cream-colored envelope. The warmth emanating from the parchment was no longer a faint pulse. It was a steady, rhythmic thrumming that resonated through his very bones. He slid the blade through the fold. There was no sound of tearing paper, only a soft, melodic sigh, like a distant choir catching its breath. As the envelope fell open, a soft golden luminescence spilled out, pooling in the palms of his weathered hands and illuminating the deep wrinkles of his face. The light wasn't blinding, it was comforting, smelling faintly of toasted marshmallows, wood smoke, and the first snowfall of winter. Inside, the parchment was blank, at least at first glance. Barnaby adjusted his brass spectacles, leaning closer. Slowly, as if painted by invisible fingers, words began to shimmer into existence. They weren't written in the clumsy scrawl of a toddler or the practiced cursive of a teenager. The script was fluid, shifting and changing, reflecting 1,000 different languages all at once. Yet Barnaby understood every syllable perfectly. To the one who listens, the letter began. "We are writing from the places where the streetlights flicker and the hearths have grown cold. We are the voices from the high-rise apartments and the small wooden huts. We do not ask for dolls that cry or trains that whistle. We do not seek the newest gadgets or the brightest trinkets." Barnaby paused, his breath hitching. In all his centuries of sorting, he had never encountered a collective plea of this magnitude. Usually, the letters were a chaotic symphony of individual desires. This, however, felt like a single, unified heartbeat. "We ask for the light to return," the text continued, the golden glow pulsing more intensely. "The world has become very loud, yet very lonely. The shadows are growing longer, and the adults have forgotten how to look at the stars. Please, Santa, if there is any magic left in the north, send us a spark. Not a gift for our hands, but a gift for our spirits. Remind us how to dream together." The ink flared a brilliant, searing blue, before settling back into a steady amber. Barnaby looked up from the parchment, his eyes stinging. The great sorting hall felt even colder now, the shadows in the corners stretching towards him like ink stains. The aurora borealis outside the window had slowed to a ghostly crawl, its vibrant greens and purples fading into a dull ashen grey. He realized then that this wasn't just the last letter of the season, it was a lifeline. The magic of the North Pole was tied to the belief and the collective hope of the world's children. If that hope was flickering out, the workshop, the reindeer, and even Nicholas himself would simply vanish. "The children of the world," he whispered, reading the final signature that spanned the bottom of the page. Barnaby didn't place this letter in a bin. He didn't categorize it or file it away. Instead, he tucked it against his chest, feeling its warmth seep through his wool vest. He knew he couldn't wait for the morning. Clutching his lantern, he hurried towards the heavy oak doors that led to the private quarters of the Claus residence. The great clock was ticking, and for the first time in an eternity, it sounded like a countdown.
Barnaby took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs,
and finally pressed the tip of the starlight-forged opener beneath the flap of the envelope. The paper didn't tear. It parted like a mist, releasing a faint scent of pine needles and warm cocoa that momentarily chased away the biting chill of the sorting hall. As he slid the parchment free, the silence of the room seemed to deepen, as if the very walls were leaning in to catch a glimpse of the contents. The letter was not what he expected. There were no messy scribbles, no frantic lists of the season's most popular gadgets, and no pleas for sweets or sleds. Instead, the page was covered in a delicate, luminous script that pulsed with a soft golden light. It was as if the words themselves were alive. Barnaby's eyes, seasoned by centuries of reading every manner of penmanship, widened as he began to scan the lines. "Dear Nicholas," the letter began, using the old name that only the most ancient of spirits or the most perceptive of children ever dared to use. "The world has grown very loud, yet also very quiet. We have forgotten the sound of the wind in the trees and the way the stars seem to hum when the night is clear. We have grown tired, and in our tiredness, we have stopped looking up." Barnaby's hands trembled, not from the cold this time, but from the sheer weight of the sentiment. He felt a lump form in his throat. The letter didn't come from a single child, he realized. It bore none signature, yet it felt as though it carried the collective heartbeat of every soul who had ever looked at a flickering candle and felt a spark of wonder. "My wish," the writing continued, the golden glow intensifying until it illuminated Barnaby's weathered face, "is not for something that can be wrapped in paper or tied with a ribbon. I wish for a bridge. I wish for a way to remind the children, those small in years and those who have lived many, that magic is not a thing you find, but a thing you carry. Grant them the eyes to see the extraordinary in the ordinary and the courage to believe in things that cannot be touched by hands." As the final words shimmered on the page, the great sorting hall underwent a subtle transformation. The shadows in the corner seemed less heavy, and a soft, rhythmic thrumming began to vibrate through the floorboards. It was the sound of the North Pole's heart beginning to beat again, a slow and steady pulse that responded to the purity of the request. Barnaby knew then that this was no ordinary correspondence. This was the last letter, because it was the only one that mattered now. It was the key to reigniting the fading spark of the world's imagination. He clutched the parchment to his chest, feeling its warmth seep through his heavy wool coat. He couldn't stay here in the silence any longer. The great sorting hall was no longer a place for filing, it was a place for action. With a newfound strength in his aged limbs, Barnaby turned toward the heavy oak doors that led to the inner sanctum of the workshop. He had to find Santa. The big man needed to see this immediately, because the frost was creeping closer to the heart of the north, and time was running out faster than the falling snow. The parchment slid out with a soft, melodic hum, unfolding itself as if it were a living thing stretching after a long slumber. Barnaby held his breath, his spectacles slipping slightly as he leaned closer to the words etched upon the page. Unlike the frantic scrawls of crayon or the neatly printed lists of the past, these characters were written in an ink that seemed to capture the very essence of the moon, a soft, pearlescent glow that illuminated Barnaby's weathered face. He began to read, and as he did, the silence of the hall transformed. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of an ending. It became a listening silence, as if the very walls were leaning in to hear the message. The letter did not come from a single child, nor did it bear a name he recognized from the great ledger of the born. Instead, the signature at the bottom read simply, "The smallest voices." "To the one who listens," the letter began, the words resonating in Barnaby's mind like the strike of a silver bell. "We are writing because the world has grown very dark, and the stars seem further away than they did before. We do not ask for dolls that cry, or trains that whistle. We do not seek sweets that melt on the tongue, or trinkets that shine for a day. Our wish is for something that cannot be wrapped in paper or tied with a ribbon of silk." Barnaby's hand steadied as he read on. The letter spoke of a collective longing, a plea for the return of wonder. It describes streets where the laughter of children had been replaced by the hum of machines, and bedrooms where the glow of screens had drowned out the soft light of bedside stories. It spoke of hearts that felt hollow, not for lack of things, but for lack of hope. "Give us the courage to dream again," the writing pleaded. "Give us the warmth that comes from knowing we are not forgotten in the shadows." A single tear escaped Barnaby's eye, landing on the edge of the parchment. Instead of soaking the paper, the droplet turned into a tiny crystalline star that skittered across the page before vanishing into the ink. He understood now why the bins were empty. The children hadn't stopped wanting. They had simply outgrown the toys that the workshop was built to provide. The North Pole was silent because the magic of the past was no longer enough to heal the wounds of the present. With a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in decades, Barnaby looked toward the massive carved oak doors at the end of the hall. Beyond those doors lay the winding corridor that led to the private study of the great giver himself. For years, Santa had remained in seclusion, watching the slow decline of the spirit of the season with a heavy heart. Barnaby tucked the glowing letter against his chest, feeling its warmth seep through his woolen tunic and into his very bones. He could not simply sort this letter into a bin. It was not a request to be filed. It was a summons. The great sorting hall, with its millions of empty spaces, was finally finished. Now the true work, the work of mending the world's broken heart, had to begin. He turned away from the last bin, his boots clicking purposefully against the cold floor, heading toward the only person who could answer such a profound cry. Barnaby squinted, his breath hitched in his throat, as the glowing script began to coalesce into legible sentences. The ink was a deep midnight blue that seemed to contain swirling galaxies, shifting every time he blinked. It wasn't just written. It was etched with a profound sense of longing that radiated from the parchment, warming Barnaby's cold, calloused fingers. The handwriting was elegant, yet carried a weight of maturity that felt out of place for a child, yet it possessed a purity that only the young could truly hold. "To the bringer of joy and the guardian of dreams," the letter began. Barnaby felt a lump form in his throat. He had read millions of greetings, "Dear Santa," to Mr. Claus, or "Hey Saint Nick," but this felt like an ancient invocation. He adjusted his spectacles, the metal warming against his skin. The letter continued. "I write to you not from a place of greed, nor from a heart seeking toys to fill a shelf. I write because the silence in the streets has grown too heavy. My friends no longer talk of flying reindeer or the magic that hides in the chimney soot. They speak of clocks, of chores, and of the gray shadows that grow when the sun goes down. They have forgotten how to imagine the impossible, and in doing so, the world has become a smaller, colder place. My wish is simple, yet I fear it is the hardest task ever asked of the North Pole. I do not want a gift for my hands. I want a gift for the children who have stopped looking at the sky." Barnaby's knees felt weak, and he pulled a wooden stool toward him, sinking onto its worn surface. The great sorting hall seemed to shrink around him, the high ceilings drawing closer, as if the building were leaning in to hear the words. The hum from the paper grew louder, a harmonious chord that resonated in his chest. "Grant us the spark," the letter pleaded. "Give the children of the world the courage to believe in things they cannot see. Remind them that wonder is a shield against the dark, and that hope is the strongest magic of all. If you can send us this, then the toys do not matter. If the heart is full of light, the hands will always find a way to create their own joy." Barnaby reached the bottom of the page. There was no signature in the traditional sense. Instead, there was a small hand-drawn symbol of a candle flame enclosed within a circle. Beneath it, a final line of text flickered. "From the last one who remembers the Song of the Stars." The elf sat in stunned silence, the soft, radiant light of the parchment illuminating his shocked expression. For centuries, he had sorted requests for bicycles and chemistry sets. He had managed material dreams with the precision of a clockmaker. But this was a request for the very essence of Christmas, the intangible magic that fueled the North Pole. He looked up at the empty bins and the dusty rafters. He knew then that he could not simply file this away. This letter was a beacon, and it had arrived just as the light was failing. With a sudden renewed purpose, Barnaby clutched the parchment to his chest. He had to find the master.
even if it meant venturing into the palace where Santa had retreated into his long silence.
Barnaby adjusted his spectacles again, his heart nearly leaping from his chest as the first sentence fully formed. It did not begin with the customary "Dear Santa" or a list of demands for plastic toys and sugar plum sweets. Instead, the words rippled like water under a moonlit sky, carrying a weight that seemed to press against the very foundations of the North Pole. "To the one who listens when the world goes quiet," the letter whispered, the sound vibrating not in Barnaby's ears, but directly within his soul. The old elf felt a prickle of magic, raw, ancient, and dangerously thin, surging through the parchment. As he read on, the great sorting hall began to react. The shadows in the corners of the room, which had grown long and oppressive during the weeks of silence, started to recede, chased away by the soft, galactic glow of the midnight blue ink. The letter spoke of a village where the chimneys no longer smoked with the warmth of hearth fires, and where the windows remained dark even on the longest nights. It told of children who had stopped looking at the sky, their heads bowed under the weight of a world that had grown too loud and too hurried to remember the soft magic of a winter's breath. "We have forgotten how to wait," the script lamented, the letters swirling into the shape of a falling star. "We have forgotten how to wonder." Barnaby's hands, gnarled like the roots of an ancient oak, tightened around the edges of the cream paper. He could feel the cold of the North Pole outside beginning to clash with the burgeoning heat of the letter. Frost patterns on the high windows began to melt, weeping clear droplets that sparkled like diamonds against the dark wood of the sorting tables. This wasn't just a request, it was a testament. It was a plea from the last heart that still believed there was something worth asking for. The writer didn't sign a name, at least not yet. Instead, the text described a collective ache, a longing for a spark to reignite the guttering candles of childhood hope. "Give them back the light," the letter implored. Not the light of a bulb or a screen, but the light that lives in the gap between a story's end and a dream's beginning. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the hall, making Barnaby jump. The massive, iron-bound doors leading to the inner sanctum, the workshop where the big man himself had retreated into a sorrowful slumber, shuddered. A single golden spark flew from the keyhole. The letter was doing more than just delivering a message. It was acting as a key, turning in a lock that had been rusted shut by the world's indifference. Barnaby knew he couldn't stay here in the sorting bin any longer. The air in the hall was now thick with the scents of ozone and peppermint, a heady mix that signaled the return of true, untamed magic. He clutched the parchment to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of its heartbeat against his own. He had to reach the inner sanctum. He had to show this to Santa before the midnight blue ink faded into the silence forever. With a newfound strength in his legs, the old elf scrambled out of the bin, his boots clicking rhythmically against the floorboards as he raced toward the trembling doors. Every step felt lighter, as if the very wooden planks were remembering how to dance under the weight of a joyous purpose, urging him forward toward a destiny he had almost forgotten. The words on the page shimmered with an inner light that seemed to draw the very shadows out from the corners of the great sorting hall. "To the Weaver of Wonders and the Keeper of the North," the script began, its midnight blue ink swirling like a miniature nebula. Barnaby's hands, gnarled and weathered like ancient oak roots, tightened around the edges of the parchment. This was no ordinary correspondence. It was a plea, written in a collective, ethereal voice, a resonant symphony of whispers gathered from every hidden corner of the globe. It felt as though he were holding the sighs of 1,000 sleepless nights and the hopes of 1,000,000 sunrise prayers. "We do not ask for things that can be broken by time or lost in the attic of memory," the letter continued, the text pulsing with a steady, rhythmic glow that echoed the beating of a heart. "We do not seek the plastic trinkets of the marketplace or the fleeting glitter of the new. We ask instead for the light to return to the hearths where the shadows have grown far too long. We ask for the silver thread of hope
to be rewoven into the fraying tapestry of our quietest nights. Barnaby felt a sharp, crystalline tear prickle the skin behind his brass spectacles. In all his centuries of service, through the rise and fall of empires and the transition from flickering candles to the blinding glare of digital screens, he had never encountered a sincerity this piercing. It wasn't just a letter, it was a testament to a fading magic. He could feel the weight of every child who had ever looked at a star and wondered if anyone was listening. As he read, the great sorting hall began to react. The thousands of empty bins, which had stood like hollow monuments to a forgotten era, started to vibrate with a low, resonant hum. The floorboards beneath his boots trembled, matching the frequency of the letter's mysterious heartbeat. Outside the frosted windows, the aurora borealis, which had been a mere ghost of green, suddenly exploded into a violent and majestic violet, its ribbons of light lashing across the polar sky. It was as if the North Pole itself was awakening from a long, sorrowful slumber, stirred by the gravity of these written words. Barnaby realized then that the eerie silence of the hall hadn't been caused by a lack of love, but by a surplus of heavy-heartedness. The children of the world hadn't stopped believing. They had simply been forced to grow up too fast, their inherent innocence taxed by a world that moved with a cold, mechanical precision. This cream-colored parchment was the final glowing ember of a dying fire, a desperate and beautiful attempt to keep the encroaching winter of the soul at bay. It was signed not by a single name, but by an intricate symbol, a circle intertwined with a 7-pointed star, the ancient sigil of the last believers. Barnaby knew he could not simply categorize this under gifts or charity. This letter transcends the mundane bureaucracy of the North Pole. It belonged in the inner sanctum, the legendary chamber where the very first spark of the Christmas spirit was housed and protected. He turned his gaze toward the heavy, iron-bound doors at the far end of the hall, the threshold to the private study of the great giver. For the first time in an age, Barnaby didn't shuffle. He moved with the urgent haste of a young sprite, his heavy boots clicking rhythmically against the stone.
Barnaby eyes traced the next line, the word pulsing against the heavy silence of the great sorting hull. We have forgotten how to look up, the ink seemed to whisper, the sound vibrating in his very bones. Barnaby felt a sharp crystalline pang of sorrow. For decades, he had watched the nature of the letter shift, becoming more about the accumulation of plastic objects and less about the preservation of sacred dreams. But this parchment held a different weight entirely. The writer wasn't asking for a possession to be unwrapped. They were pleading for the restoration of a world that had lost its color and its hope. The letter spoke of a heavy, invisible shadow falling over the hearts of children everywhere, a creeping, suffocating grayness that made them forget the taste of magic and the rhythmic, comforting song of the falling snow. The stars are dimming because no one watches them anymore, the letter continued, the midnight blue ink swirling like a trapped storm within the paper. The songs are fading because no one hums them in their sleep. We are losing the ability to believe in what cannot be touched or bought. Barnaby felt the terrifying truth of it in his marrow. He looked around the cavernous hall, the empty wooden bins reflecting his own growing fear. The great sorting hall wasn't empty because the children were being naughty. It was empty because they were being hollowed out by a world that had grown too fast, too loud, and too cynical. The magic of the North Pole was fueled by the collective imagination of the world, and that reservoir was running dangerously dry. My wish, the script glowed with a sudden fierce intensity that made Barnaby's brass spectacles fog, is for the Great Awakening. Do not send us things that break or rust. Send a reminder that the invisible is more real than the seen, and that wonder is the only fire that keeps the frost from the soul. Remind us how to dream again before the last light goes out. Barnaby gripped the edges of the parchment so hard his knuckles turned the color of the snow outside. This was no mere request for the workshop elves to fulfill with wood, paint, and gears. This was a cosmic SOS, a desperate flare launched from a world on the brink of a spiritual winter. He looked out the frosted windows where the aurora borealis flared a violent, panicked purple, then flickered, losing its luster as if the very sky were gasping for air.
He knew then that his duty as a sorter had ended. He couldn't simply file this under general or even urgent. There were no piles left and no time to spare for bureaucratic tradition. The weight of the world's remaining hope was resting in his gnarled, trembling hands. Barnaby stood up, his joints pubbing like dry twigs in the stillness. He reached for his heavy, crimson wool coat hanging from a silver peg by the door, a garment he hadn't needed to wear in over a decade. He wouldn't wait for the morning bell or the arrival of the lesser clerks. He needed to find the Master of the North, the Weaver of Wonders himself, who had been secluded in the highest tower of the sanctum for far too long. Barnaby tucked the glowing letter into his breast pocket, right against his heart, and stepped out into the buying wind, the last sentinel of a fading dream.
Barnaby thrust the glowing script with a trembling finger. The midnight blue ink didn't just sit on the parchment, it moved with a liquid grace, each letter a doorway into a memory he hadn't realized he held. Our world is loud with the sound of many things, the letter continued, the script thinning into elegant sharp lines, but it has become quiet in the ways that truly matter. We have traded the mystery of the woods for the certainty of the screen, and the whispering wind for the constant chatter of wires. Barnaby looked up from the page for a moment, his eyes drifting to the high arched rafters of the great sorting hall. He remembered when the air here used to be thick with the scent of sawdust, peppermint, and the little sparks of imagination. Now the silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. The letter was right. The magic hadn't just faded, it had been crowded out, pushed into the dark corners by a world that no longer had space for things that couldn't be measured or bought. We are the children of the great dimming, the words shimmered, turning a soft bruised violet. We possess everything but hold nothing. We know the price of the world but have lost the value of a dream. Therefore, we do not write to you for toys that will eventually find their way to the dust beneath our beds. We do not ask for the latest marvels of clockwork or the bright painted trinkets of the workshop. Barnaby's heart skipped a beat. If they weren't asking for toys, what was left? For as long as he had served as the master sorter, the requests had been tangible. A bicycle, a doll with porcelain skin, a wooden train set. This letter was stripping away the very foundation of the North Pole's industry. It was an existential challenge to the holiday itself, a plea that could not be answered by an elf with a hammer or a needle. The in-flat writer, casting long dancing shadows across the empty sorting bins. We wish for the stars to be seen again, the letter whispered into the cold air. We wish for the silence to be filled with the sound of stories told by firelight. We wish for the bravery to believe in what we cannot touch, and the wisdom to cherish what cannot be owned. Give us back the wonder, Weaver. Give us back the night. As the final word of the paragraph settled into the parchment, a low vibration began to thud through the floorboards. It was a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the very bedrock of the world. The great sorting hall, which had been dormant and cold, suddenly felt alive. The dust motes in the air began to glow like tiny golden embers, swirling in the draft of an unseen wind. Barnaby realized then that this was no ordinary correspondence. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. This was the collective heartbeat of a generation that was suffocating under the weight of the mundane. The letter was a bridge between the dying spark of magic and the only place on earth where that fire could be reignited. He clutched the parchment to his chest, feeling its warmth seep through his heavy woolen vest. He couldn't stay here in the shadows of the hall anymore. The sorting was done, but a much greater task lay ahead. He had to find the master. He had to reach the inner sanctum of the frost hut, where the great weaver waited in the silence. Barnaby adjusted his spectacles, turned his back on the empty bins, and began the long walk toward the iron-bound walls at the far end of the hall.
Barnaby let out a shaky breath, the vapor swirling like a ghost in the dim light of the great sorting hall. The words, loud with the sound of many things, seemed to vibrate against his palms, the parchment pulsing with a rhythmic heat. He adjusted his brass spectacles, focusing on the next line as the midnight blue ink began to swirl once more, forming images alongside the text. It is a noise of glass and metal, the letter continued, the script now jagged and sharp, like the skyline of a crowded city. A noise that drowns out the rustle of the leaves and the secret language of the wind. The children are surrounded by echoes, Barnaby. They speak to boxes that do not breathe and listen to songs that have no soul. They are lost in a forest of static, and the path back to the hearth is overgrown with the weeds of indifference. Barnaby felt a cold thirst that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. For centuries he had sorted requests for dolls that cried real tears and trains that puffed real steam. He had understood those desires. They were tangible expressions of a child's imagination. But this
This was a cry from the very center of a hollowed-out spirit. The letter wasn't asking for a possession. It was documenting a disappearance. He looked up from the parchment, his eyes scanning the endless rows of empty bins. The great sorting hall felt like a tomb, a monument to a magic that was slowly being choked out by the frantic pace of the world beyond the ice. He remembered when the mail came by the ton, each envelope a spark of belief that kept the North Pole spinning. Now, there was only this single glowing page, and the weight of it was heavier than all the millions of letters that had come before. The ink shifted again, the midnight blue bleeding into a soft, bruised violet. A vision shimmered on the surface of the paper, a young girl sitting by a window in a high-rise apartment. Outside, the sky was a muddy orange, choked by the lights of a city that never slept. She wasn't looking at a screen, nor was she playing with a toy. Her forehead was pressed against the cold glass, her eyes wide and searching, looking for a single point of light in a sky that had been scrubbed clean of stars. "They have forgotten the taste of moonlight," the script whispered, the sound echoing in Barnaby's mind like a distant bell. "They have forgotten how to sit in the stillness and hear the heartbeat of the earth. We do not ask for things that can be wrapped in paper and tied with string. We ask for the return of the invisible. We ask for the re-enchantment of the dark." Barnaby's hands shook so violently that he had to rest the letter on the sorting table. The starlight-forged opener lay nearby, its silver surface reflecting the violet glow of the parchment. He realized then that this was not just the last letter to Santa. It was a manifesto of the forgotten, a desperate plea for a miracle that no workshop could build. The great sorting hall, once a place of industry, was now a sanctuary for a dying hope. Barnaby knew he could not simply file this away. He had to find the master of the North. He had to show him that the world wasn't just changing, it was fading.
Barnaby leaned Chin so closely that the tip of his nose nearly brushed the shimmering parchment. The midnight blue ink pulsed, casting a sapphire glow across his weathered features. "The voices of the children have become small," the script lamented, the letters elongating as if reaching out to him. "They are drowned out by the relentless gears of a cluttered world, a world that values the speed of the machine over the stillness of the soul, and the cold weight of facts over the shimmering truth of a dream." Barnaby felt a lump form in his throat. He remembered the era of wooden horses and hand-stitched dolls, when a child's imagination was the strongest fuel in the universe. Back then, the North Pole hummed with a different energy, one born of pure, unadulterated belief. Now, the great sorting hall felt like a tomb for that lost wonder. He turned his gaze back to the parchment, his eyes misting behind his brass frames. "We are surrounded by light," the letter continued, the ink swirling faster now. "Yet we live in a strange kind of darkness. It is a darkness where we see everything but feel nothing. We have been given tools to talk to everyone, yet we have never felt more alone. The magic hasn't left the world, Weaver. We have simply lost the eyes to see it." The heat from the paper intensified, warming Barnaby's cold fingers until the chill of the hall was but a distant memory. He could almost hear the collective sigh of a million children, a soft melancholy sound that drifted through the ink like a ghost. This was no ordinary plea for a bicycle or a chemistry set. This was a cry for help from the very heart of childhood itself. "So we do not ask for toys that will break," the script flowed on, the words becoming larger and more urgent. "We do not ask for gadgets that will grow obsolete before the snow melts. We ask for the one thing that has been stolen by the noise. We ask for the gift of the great pause." Barnaby paused, his heart skipping a beat. The great pause? He had heard tales of such a thing in the oldest elven archives, ancient scrolls written before the first star was named. It was a moment when time itself held its breath, allowing the world to reset, to listen, and to remember what truly mattered.
"We wish for a night where the screens go dark and the wires go silent," the letter pleaded. "A night where the only light comes from the stars and the embers in the hearth. Give us back the wonder of the unknown. Give us a Christmas that cannot be bought, sold, or downloaded. Give us a reason to look up once more." The parchment began to vibrate, a low hum that shook the very foundations of the sorting table. Barnaby realized with a jolt of terror and awe that this letter was a catalyst. It wasn't just a message, it was a key. If he finished reading it, if he acknowledged the weight of this collective wish, the old ways would have to change forever. The machinery of the North Pole was not built for such a request. It was built for wood, paint, and ribbon. The air in the great sorting hall thickened, pressing against his chest. To grant a wish for the great pause would require a sacrifice far greater than anything Barnaby had ever known.
Barnaby's heart ached with a weight he hadn't felt in centuries. The words "small voices" echoed in his mind, conjuring images of children standing in the shadows of towering, humming machines and glowing screens. He looked around the great sorting hall. Once, this place had been the epicenter of global hope, a celestial post office where every scribble was a testament to belief. Now, the empty bins looked like hollow rib cages, and the silence was a physical pressure against his eardrums. He turned his attention back to the parchment, his eyes misting. The midnight blue ink began to swirl more violently now, the nebulas within the letters spinning like tiny trapped storms. They no longer asked for the painted horse or the locomotive of brass, the script read, the letters thinning into delicate sharp lines. They asked for the return of the stars. They asked for the silence that allows a heart to be heard. They ask for the thread that binds one soul to another, a thread we fear has frayed to its very end. Barnaby felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead despite the freezing draft. This wasn't just a request, it was a diagnosis of a world losing its magic. For the first time in his long life, Barnaby realized that the North Pole was not just a toy factory, it was a lighthouse. And if the lighthouse had no oil, the ships would surely be lost in the dark. The next line of the letter glowed with a sudden, piercing intensity that made him blink. "We are the children who have stopped dreaming because the world told us dreams are but shadows," the ink whispered, its voice now a chorus of 1,000 tiny sighs. "But we have one final spark left. We give it to you, Weaver of Wonders, so that you might strike a flame." As Barnaby read this, a tiny golden ember detached itself from the surface of the parchment. It floated upward, bobbing in the frigid air like a lost firefly. The golden ember seemed to pulse in time with Barnaby's own frightened heart. It was beautiful, but it was also terrifyingly fragile. He watched it with bated breath, afraid that even a single exhale would extinguish it. This was it. The wish wasn't a demand. It was a gift, a desperate offering of the last remnants of childhood wonder. Barnaby knew he couldn't stay in a sorting hall any longer. The protocol for a Code Crimson or a Shuttered Star event had been gathered in dusty manuals for errors, but no one had ever expected to use them. He needed to find the one person who could handle a spark this precious. He needed to find Nicholas. But as he turned toward the heavy oak doors, the light from the letter flared once more, revealing a final haunting sentence at the very bottom of the page. It wasn't written in blue ink, but in a searing, brilliant white that burned into his vision. "If this flame dies," the letter warned, "the North Pole will vanish with the morning sun, and the world will wake to a sky without a North Star." The stakes had never been higher. Barnaby clutched the letter to his chest, feeling its warmth seep through his heavy wool coat. He didn't just have a letter, he held the heartbeat of the world's future in his gnarled hands. With a newfound urgency, he hurried toward the door, his boots thudding against the icy stone.
Barnaby's eyes blurred behind his spectacles as he read the next passage. The ink shifted from midnight blue to a shimmering pearlescent white, casting a soft luminescence that bathed his gnarled hands in a spectral glow. "We do not ask for toys that break or gadgets that grow silent," the script pleaded, the letters twisting like ivy vines across the parchment. "We ask for the return of the wonderlight. We ask for the stars to be seen through the smog of our busy lives, and for the silence to be filled with the whispers of ancient stories once more." Barnaby felt a sudden, sharp intake of air. The wonderlight. It was a term he hadn't heard spoken aloud in over a millennium.
It referred to the raw, unadulterated magic of belief, the fuel that powered the great sleigh and kept the North Pole anchored to the physical world. Without it, the aurora borealis would fade into gray smoke, and the elves would become nothing more than echoes of a forgotten era. The letter was not just a request, it was a lifeline, a final cry for the preservation of the world's enchantments. "Give us back the eyes that see the unseen," the letter continued, the ink now pulsing with the rhythm of a frantic heart. "Let the children find the hidden paths in the woods and the secrets hidden in the wind. Do not let the magic die with the setting of this century's sun." Barnaby stood frozen, the parchment vibrating against his fingertips. He looked up at the vast, empty racks of the great sorting hall. For years, the decline had been gradual. Fewer letters each winter, shorter lists every season. He had categorized it as a shift in trends, a cold reality of a changing age. But this letter stripped away the euphemisms. The children weren't just asking for less, they were losing the ability to ask at all. Their voices weren't small because they were quiet. They were small because they were being drowned out by a world that no longer believed in the impossible. A sudden, resonant chime echoed through the hall, the great clock of the north, marking the 11th hour. Barnaby knew he could no longer sit in the stillness of his sorting station. This letter was the catalyst he had been waiting for, the final piece of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was solving. He didn't just need to sort this, he needed to deliver it personally. The great sorting hall was no longer the end of the journey, it was the beginning of a desperate rescue mission. With a resolve that made his old bones feel surprisingly light, Barnaby tucked the glowing parchment into the inner pocket of his velvet coat, right over his heart. The warmth of the letters seeped through the fabric, chasing away the bone-deep chill. He reached for his walking stick, a sturdy branch of rowanwood tipped with moonstone. "I am coming, Nicholas," he whispered into the rafters, his voice cracking but firm. He turned away from the last empty bin and began the long trek toward the forbidden corridor, the passage that led to the sanctum where the great weaver sat in solitude. The North Pole might have been fading, but as long as one heart still carried the weight of a child's true wish, the magic could not yet be extinguished. He stepped into the shadows, the sapphire light from his pocket guiding his way through the gathering gloom.
Barnaby's breath hitched as the pearlescent script began to swirl, forming shapes that looked less like letters and more like the constellations he had studied from the observatory tower. The warmth emanating from the parchment intensified, turning the biting chill of the great sorting hall into a gentle, spring-like embrace. He adjusted his spectacles, his eyes widening as the true request finally manifested on the page. "Grant us the sight to see the invisible," the letter whispered, the sound now audible, like 1,000 tiny bells ringing in harmony. "We wish for a spark that cannot be manufactured in a factory or programmed by a machine. We wish for the return of wonder." Barnaby felt a tear escape the corner of his eye, tracing a path through the deep wrinkles of his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but one of profound recognition. For centuries, he had sorted requests for dolls that cried and trains that puffed real smoke, but he had watched the light behind those requests dim year after year. The children didn't want things anymore. They wanted the essence of childhood itself, a commodity that had been slowly traded away for the convenience of the modern age. The parchment began to glow with a soft, rhythmic pulse, matching the beat of Barnaby's heart. "Remind us," the script continued, the white ink now shimmering with a hint of gold, "that the world is still wide, that the wind has secrets to tell, and that we are the authors of our stories. Give us back the quietness required to hear the world's ancient song." As he read, the great sorting hall seemed to transform. The empty bins, once symbols of a dying tradition, began to hum with a low, resonant frequency. The shadows retreated further, replaced by a soft, ethereal light that seemed to emanate from the walls. Barnaby realized that this letter was not just a message, it was a catalyst.
It was the collective heartbeat of a generation reaching out across the void of the digital age, seeking a tether to the magic they had been told no longer existed. Barnaby knew he could no longer sit at his desk. The protocols of the Great Sorting Hall, established when the world was much younger, were no longer sufficient for a wish of this magnitude. This was not a dream to be categorized, filed, or passed along to the workshop elves for manufacturing. This was a plea for a spiritual restoration, a rekindling of the human spirit that required a higher authority. With trembling hands, Barnaby carefully folded the parchment. He didn't place it in a tray or a bin. Instead, he tucked it against his chest, feeling its warmth seep through his heavy wool coat. He stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs, but his movements were imbued with a new, urgent purpose. The silence of the hall was no longer oppressive. It was expectant. He turned toward the great oak doors at the far end of the hall, the ones that led to the inner sanctum where the Weaver of Wonders himself resided. Those doors hadn't been opened in a decade, not since the Great Dimming began. Barnaby took a step forward, his boots crunching on the light dusting of frost. Every step felt lighter than the last, as if the letter itself were lifting him. He had to deliver this. The children were waiting, and for the first time in a long time, Barnaby felt hope was more than just a word on a piece of paper.
The constellations danced before Barnaby's eyes, their light so intense that the ancient elf had to blink several times to clear his vision. The warmth that had begun to radiate from the parchment was now a steady, pulsing glow, chasing the last vestiges of the winter's bite into the high, darkened rafters of the Great Sorting Hall. The air no longer smelled of old paper and stagnant dust. Instead, it was filled with the intoxicating scent of wild jasmine, rain on dry earth, and the crisp, clean ozone of a coming spring. The letter was breathing. Every pulse of the pearlescent ink felt like a physical heartbeat against his gnarled fingertips. He leaned in, his brass spectacles nearly falling from his nose, as the celestial patterns began to reorganize themselves back into legible words. This time, the language was older than any he had sorted in his 3 centuries of service. It was a language of symbols, of raw emotion, and of unspoken truths. Yet Barnaby understood it perfectly. The collective voice of the world's children wasn't asking for a miracle of production or a feat of engineering, but a miracle of perception. "We do not seek the gold of the mountains or the silver of the sea," the script pulsed, the white light turning a soft, comforting amber. "We seek the golden thread that binds us to one another. We ask for the return of the stories told by the hearth, for the quiet of the woods, and for the laughter that doesn't require a power source. We ask for the gift of presence in a world that is only ever half there." Barnaby felt a single tear escape the corner of his eye, tracing a path through the deep wrinkles of his cheek. He remembered the era of the hearth stories. He remembered when the North Pole buzzed with the energy of pure, unadulterated imagination, rather than the cold, mechanical efficiency of the modern age. The letter was a mirror, reflecting the profound loneliness of a generation that possessed every gadget imaginable, but felt as though they had nothing at all. "Give us the gift of being seen," the final passage of the main body began, the amber light deepening into a rich royal gold. "Not by a lens, but by the eyes of those who love us. Give us a world that waits for the sunrise with bated breath, knowing that the magic is not in the object, but in the moment." The letter began to fold itself back up again, but not into its original cream-colored rectangle. It folded with a rhythmic clicking, shifting into the shape of a small glowing bird, its wings translucent and shimmering with the colors of a distant nebula. It sat in the palm of Barnaby's hand, its tiny chest rising and falling in sync with his own. The silence of the Great Sorting Hall was no longer eerie, it was expectant. The void in the bins didn't matter anymore, for this single message outweighed every toy ever carved or doll ever sewn. Barnaby stood up, his joints popping with a sound like crackling firewood. He realized with a start that the aurora borealis outside was no longer pulsing with its usual green. It had turned a brilliant, shimmering white.
The task was far too great for an elf. This was a request that required the Weaver of Wonders himself. Clutching the light to his chest, Barnaby turned toward the great oak doors, ready to wake the master.
The starlight forged opener lay forgotten on the antique mahogany table as Barnaby leaned into the brilliance. The constellations on the parchment began to spin with dizzying speed, faster and faster, until they blurred into a blinding point of radiance. Then, as if a cosmic curtain had been pulled back, the light softened into a gentle glow, and the final words began to crystallize. These sentences did not appear in ink, but in a shimmering, ethereal essence, woven from the very fabric of long-forgotten dreams and the quiet sighs of 1,000 nights. Barnaby held his breath, his eyes wide behind his breast spectacles, as the message finally revealed the core of the children's collective longing. "Give us back the night sky," the words pleaded, the pearlescent script trembling with an ancient, quiet power. "Give us the courage to be still, the wisdom to hear the whispers of the wind, and the grace to see the magic in the mundane. We no longer wish for things to own, but for the thread that binds us all, the spark of wonder that turns a stranger into a brother, and a cold, lonely night into a sanctuary of hope." Barnaby felt a single tear escape the corner of his eye, tracing a slow path through the deep, weathered lines of his face. He hadn't wept in centuries, not since the era of the Great Forgetting, but the pure, unadulterated sincerity of the request cracked the icy shell around his ancient heart. This wasn't a demand for a fleeting possession. It was a prayer for a spiritual transformation. The children weren't asking for things to hold in their hands. They were asking for something to hold in their souls. As he finished reading, the ancient great sorting hall underwent a breathtaking metamorphosis. The heavy shadows that had lurked in the vaulted rafters for decades were instantly dissolved by the letter's expanding glow. The dormant machinery of the North Pole, the intricate gears of the clockwork reindeer, and the silent looms that once wove velvet stockings began to hum with a low, resonant frequency. It was the song of a world awakening. The frozen ink in the glimmering crystal wells thawed, and the dusty ledgers on the shelves seemed to shiver with a newfound anticipation. Barnaby looked toward the towering oak doors at the far end of the hall, the ones that led directly to the inner sanctum, where the great gift-giver himself resided. For years, those doors had remained firmly shut, the hearth within cooling as the world's belief flickered like a dying candle in a storm. But now a sliver of gold-white peeked through the keyhole, responding to the call of the letter. The ancient elf knew his duty. He was no longer just a sorter. He was the guardian of a new age. With a reverence that made his movements slow and deliberate, he carefully lifted the parchment. It felt weightless, yet it carried the gravity of 1,000 suns. He stepped away from the sorting bin, his boots clicking rhythmically against the polished stone floor, each step amplifying the melody of returning magic. Barnaby reached the great doors, his breath steady and his heart full, ready to deliver the wish that would finally change everything for the children of the world. He raised his hand, the parchment glowing like a star between his fingers, and prepared to knock upon the massive door. Barnaby stood rooted to the spot as the great sorting hall dissolved into a panorama of the world below. The stone walls and high rafters vanished, replaced by a sweeping view of cityscapes and quiet villages, all veiled in a gray, flickering haze. He saw millions of children, their faces illuminated not by the soft glow of candles or the moon, but by the cold, frantic light of rectangular screens. Their eyes were wide but hollow, their thumbs moving in a rhythmic, mechanical dance. The silence he had felt in the hall was mirrored down there, but it was a heavy, lonely silence, a lack of song, a lack of stories whispered under bedsheets. Then the pearlescent light from the letter began to bleed into the vision. It didn't strike like lightning. It flowed like a rising tide of liquid silver. It touched the windows of the tallest skyscrapers and the thatched roofs of distant huts. As the light reached the children, the small voices the letter had lamented began to find their resonance. Barnaby heard a soft hum,
then a giggle, then the collective intake of 1,000 breaths as children everywhere suddenly looked up. They looked away from the flickering glass and toward the windows, toward the stars, toward each other. The script on the parchment, now floating in midair before Barnaby's tear-streaked face, coalesced into one final soaring command. It wasn't a list of toys. It was a plea for the restoration of the soul. Grant them the gift of the great stillness, the letters pulsed, in a rhythm that matched Barnaby's own heartbeat. Remind them that the world is wide, that the wind has stories, and that they are the architects of the unseen. We do not need things to hold. We need the wonder that holds us. Barnaby finally understood. This was the last letter, because it was the only one that mattered anymore. The era of tin soldiers and plastic trinkets had reached its twilight. The children didn't want more things to consume. They wanted the magic that had been drowned out by the noise of a busy, distracted world. They wanted to be seen, to be heard, and to believe in a world that existed beyond what could be bought or sold. The vision began to retract, pulling back into the cream-colored parchment until the great sorting hall solidified around him once more. The air was no longer biting. It was charged with an electric, hopeful energy. The letter lay still on the mahogany table, but it continued to glow with a soft, steady warmth. Barnaby's gnarled hands no longer trembled. A profound clarity had settled over him, sharper than any starlight-forged blade. He knew that his task in the sorting hall was finished, but a much greater journey was about to begin. He reached out and gingerly folded the parchment, tucking it into the inner breast pocket of his heavy, scarlet-lined woolen coat, right over his beating heart. He didn't need his brass spectacles now. He could see the path ahead with a perfect internal luminescence that guided his every move. There was only one vital thing left to do. He had to find the Master of the North before the clock struck midnight. He had to deliver the wish that would change the world's heart forever. With a firm, decisive step that belied his centuries, Barnaby turned toward the massive, frost-rimmed doors that led to the private chambers of the Weaver of Wonders. The final bell of Christmas Eve was about to toll, and the world was waiting.
Barnaby watched as the flickering blue light from millions of screens reflected in his brass spectacles, creating a cold, disjointed mosaic of isolation. The gray haze he saw wasn't just a mist, it was a veil of forgetfulness that had settled over the hearts of the young. He felt the immense weight of the centuries pressing down on him. The great sorting hall had always been a place of noise, but this new silence from the world was a vacuum, threatening to extinguish the magic that kept the North Pole tethered to reality. The parchment in his hands began to vibrate with a frequency that hummed in his teeth. The pearlescent white ink gathered itself, swirling into a singular, final sentence that blazed with the intensity of a dying star. "We do not seek a gift for the hand," the letters whispered into Barnaby's mind, "but a spark for the soul. Remind us how to dream without a glow in our palms." Barnaby understood then. This was not a letter from one child, but the collective, unspoken cry of a generation drowning in the digital tide. He looked at the silver letter opener, still resting on the mahogany table, its starlight-forged edge shimmering. With a steady hand and a heart overflowing with a sudden, fierce hope, he didn't use the tool. Instead, he pressed his garnet palm flat against the glowing script. "So be it," Barnaby whispered. An explosion of light, more vibrant than the most spectacular aurora, erupted from the cream-colored parchment. It wasn't a destructive force, but a gentle, sweeping wave of gold and sapphire that rushed through the great sorting hall, dissolving the stone walls and flowing out across the frozen wastes. Barnaby watched, his eyes wide behind his spectacles, as the magic reached the cities and villages he had seen in the vision. The effect was instantaneous and subtle. In 1,000 time zones, children paused. In a bustling metropolis, a young boy let his tablet slip onto the rug as he noticed a single crystalline snowflake dancing against the window pane. In a quiet suburb, a girl turned off her humming console, drawn by the sudden magnificent clarity of the constellations visible through her bedroom glass. The grey haze didn't just lift, it was transmuted into a shimmering atmosphere of possibility. The magic didn't break the machines, but it restored the balance. It gave the children back their wonder, granting them the sight to see the enchantments hidden in the mundane. The small voices the letter had lamented began to grow, not in volume, but in depth and resonance. They were talking again. They spoke to the stars, to the trees, and to each other. As the brilliance faded, Barnaby found himself standing once more in the center of the great sorting hall. The stone walls were solid, the mahogany table was warm, and the biting chill was gone, replaced by the scent of pine and fresh-baked cocoa. The last bin was empty, and the cream envelope had vanished, leaving only a faint, lingering warmth on Barnaby's palm. He adjusted his glass spectacles, a soft smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in years, the hall didn't feel empty. It felt like a held breath, ready to be exhaled into a new era of joy. Barnaby turned toward the oak doors, ready to tell the weaver of wonders that the world had finally looked up. The last letter had been answered, and the magic was just beginning.